Well, hi, everybody. We have a session today to focus on practical discussion on how to use multidimensional sound. We are short one panelist, and he's having some technical difficulties. Hopefully, he will find his way in. But we do have a good group of folks here to have this conversation with you all. Maybe as a start point, we'll just do quick introductions here to give some understanding of who we are, and then I'll turn it over to Rhonda to give an introduction to the topic that we're discussing, and we'll just go from there. This is just a discussion panel. There's no fancy videos or slides or anything like that. If you have any questions as this goes, please add that into the Q&A section, and I will try to keep track of that as we go and reserve some time at the end for any answers that we can get to for that. With that, maybe we just go around the room and people can introduce themselves. Rhonda, do you want to go first?
Okay, yes. So I'm Rhonda Wilson. I'm based in San Francisco. I'm in the Sound Technology Research Group, which is part of our Advanced Technology Group at Dolby. And I lead a team based here in San Francisco and also one in Sydney.
Thank you. Alan, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Seefeldt, a principal member of the research staff, and I work on Rhonda's team, also based in San Francisco. Been at Dolby quite some time, about 18 years, working on a wide variety of audio algorithm development in the research department.
The inventor is what we call him here.
Exactly. Guy who makes all the magic happen.
Yeah. Philip.
I'm Philip Nicol. I'm like a newbie compared to Alan. I've been around about 7 years at Dolby now. Done a variety of roles. Started off in business development, moved into our corporate strategy team, looking at some M&A opportunities, and then most recently have taken over the business side of our Dolby I/O developer platform. Really what we're doing with Dolby I/O is taking a lot of the technology that we've developed over the years and creating a lot of new technology and making that available as APIs and SDKs for the developer community. So it's really a business for Dolby, but one that's really exciting and growing quickly. I've also worked throughout my time at Dolby and before that in the music side of the business, and worked a lot on the Dolby Atmos technologies as well.
Thank you, Philip. The person we're missing is Justin Vandergrift, and hopefully he'll find his way into the session. When he does, he heads up audio engineering for our biggest business group, the group that does all of our licensed technologies and turns all of these cool inventions we have into products and get it out into the world. And I'm RJ Harrison. I run operations. I head up operations for that particular group, that business group. I'm 10 years at Dolby, so I'm someplace in the middle. I'm not an old timer yet because there's some longevity at this company. But I've been around, and like Philip, I've seen had a few different roles here. Currently, the scope that I have is 8 discrete different functions, everything from strategic frameworks to program management to audio standards to how we function and a bunch of other things in between. So I see a lot and I touch a lot as we move through time. With that, so you got a pretty good scope of some folks that have been involved in a whole lot of the things that actually are material to what we do at Dolby. And specific to this conversation actually today, every one of us have had our hands on this at some point. So with that, Rhonda, do you want to maybe give a little introduction to kind of the scope of what we're discussing?
Sure, thanks very much. Yes, so at Dolby, when we think about multi-dimension sound, we're essentially thinking about Dolby Atmos, and it was with Dolby Atmos that we introduced an object-based format. So prior to that, I would say what people would be most familiar with in terms of multi-dimensional sound were the 5.1 and 7.1 channel formats that are commonly used in cinemas and also somewhat in, for home theater as well. And Dolby's played a huge role in that. But then with Dolby Atmos, we really moved forward by thinking about objects rather than speaker channels. And so when I talk about a sound object, I'm thinking, okay, there's the sound represented, say, in the signal, the waveform of that, and where do I want to place it in space? And we can describe that with metadata in terms of the XYZ coordinates. We can also specify how big in size, how much volume of the room we want it to occupy, so some size metadata on that. And by describing it in objects, we can free ourselves from the constraints of particular loudspeaker locations. And so then, regardless of whether you've got 20 loudspeakers or 64 loudspeakers in your cinema, or whether you're trying to get it out of headphones or out of a soundbar, we've got that core information, and then we'll come up with the best rendering techniques according to that playback device so that we can get that spatial or multidimensional sound. So there's our very brief intro to Dolby Atmos.
Thank you. Well, and in that, I mean, that talks a lot about kind of what this thing actually is. Then there's the part about realizing that, and there's everything that, you know, that comes from content creation. I mean, there's the inventing of this kind of capability. And then there's how that applies to content creation tools and that whole process and the workflows and spaces associated with that. There's stuff around playback and how that actually ends up in various devices. There's things around distribution. There's things around the rest of the scale of the entire set of other skills that are necessary to package a product up and get it out the door. And all of those become elements of that. And we'll touch on some pieces of that as we go through the conversation. And maybe we start with content creation, since that's kind of the kickoff part of this. I don't know, Alan, do you want to maybe take a stab at kicking off some conversation around thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, as Rhonda mentioned, you know, a big part of Atmos is freeing mixers from, you know, the confines of channels and thinking about mixing there, and rather mixing in three-dimensional space. So, you know, that was somewhat of a new mixing paradigm. So at the very beginning of Atmos, we worked very closely with the content creation community to figure out how to best expose these new features to them. And so it wasn't something that we developed in complete, you know, in isolation by ourselves and just handed off to the content creation community. It was very much a collaboration where we iterated with them, you know, in the cinema closely. We had one person, for example, you know, live coding changes to our kind of research prototype as they were getting feedback from, you know, people at a very well-known recording studio. And, you know, those tools have evolved over time. You know, we started off in the cinema, providing tools, and as we move into the home, you know, there are other needs there, and you know, one of the more recent things we're doing is music production with Dolby Atmos, and there are yet again different you know, requirements, and so it's kind of a constant process as we are, you know, learning from mixers how to best you know, expose the power of this Atmos technology, and you know, get the most kind of get them to be creative while dealing with this new technology. So it's been a challenge, but also a really exciting development process. And I think that's a unique thing about Dolby, is that we work so closely with the content creation community. It's always starting with the content creation first. I'll look for others to add on to that, perhaps, maybe some of the more technical aspects of things that we've developed on the content creation side.
So maybe I'll just add in a little bit in terms of, especially recently, like in the last 14 months or so, while we've had to work in the work from home scenario during the pandemic, and also that although Atmos started in the cinema, we're also doing a whole lot in terms of music with Atmos. And some key things to help enable things during the pandemic has been the work on the binaural rendering and the tools to make that as easy as possible. So as well as there being all sorts of information available on how to best set up studios or cinema dub stages and having the tools for that, you can also work with a MacBook and your headphones and do an enormous amount of the content creation work in the home environment like that. And that's been essential to be able to continue producing music throughout the pandemic. And that's another illustration in terms of making use of the object-based format. So we've got the freedom of, okay, well, the objects, wherever the content creator decides they want to put it. And in the case of headphone rendering, we're thinking about, well, okay, what's happening between where that signal would be and how it reaches our two ears, and what else happens in the room, and how can we model that so that we get the right spatial effects as we play back on headphones. And then those same tools, if they go into the studio, they can easily change over to the rendering that is relevant to the loudspeaker setup. Yeah. Yeah,
I would just add that sort of on the a practical side, I guess, of content creation, you know, we've worked really hard to create a series of tools that allow content creators using the tool of their choice, whether it's Pro Tools or something else, to be able to mix in Atmos. And we've worked very closely with a number of labels as well, and ultimately distribution services to make those tools available and really work closely with them in terms of not only teaching the engineers but also providing a lot of materials, and we've created a lot of materials too at the university level to help with things like curriculum, quick start guides, and we also allow a lot of pre-trials and production suite downloads available to students specifically to be able to use some of the tools. And I'll actually, in the chat here, I'll post a few things that that might be of interest to the group. That includes some production suite free trials, some quick start videos, as I mentioned, and also we have a full curriculum, which I'll also post there for your reference.
Yeah, great. You know, it struck me as you guys were talking too, there is a certain robustness to this solution that we've come up with. It didn't just magically come. It was something that we've worked hard on over years to, make available and implement. But that notion of when we start, we're starting with some of these top players and some of these big studios, and it's a very controlled environment, and you can set up speakers in exactly the right place. And they tend to be high-end speakers and all the rest of that. But as we've moved through time, you make that more open and more available. And especially when you start playing with, music, where those people do things in all sorts of different, I record in this room sometimes, all sorts of different configurations. And all the way from these big robust setups to smaller, less perfect speakers to headphones and everything else. And we do have that ability, though, now to be able to map across all of those different environments. If we move on to the playback side of this, just kind of evolving from that. So now we've got this content that we've created. And it could be cinematic, it could be TV content, it could be music, it could be any kind of content. And you've got now humans that want to hear this thing and experience that. So, Alan, I know you in particular did some work up front to try to realize, not everybody's going to have speakers in their ceiling, regardless of whether we want them to or not. So how'd you go about thinking about that and conquering that challenge?
Yeah, thanks. So it's been a pretty interesting journey trying to take Atmos from its beginnings in the cinema and have it kind of flow down into a variety of different consumer contexts. And so we started thinking about that almost from the very beginning of when Atmos was developed in the cinema. Dolby has traditionally taken its technologies that start, for example, in the cinema, and they work their ways into the home. So on the cinema side, we've got lots of loudspeakers. Obviously, Atmos added another layer of loudspeakers on the ceiling so that you could, wrap the audience in three-dimensional sound. And in the cinema, there's this flexibility of being able to scale the system to a variety of different numbers of speakers in the cinema. So you could kind of customize the system to those different speaker counts. They weren't fixed to a particular count, and they could scale it up to whatever makes sense in that particular space. But it's still, a lot of loudspeakers. And, we know from experience that requiring consumers to put lots of loudspeakers in the home can oftentimes be challenging. We've had 5.1 surround sound, 7.1 surround sound in the home for quite some time. And we looked at kind of building off of that install base of home theater. And it was obvious that, we could add speakers on the ceiling. And in fact, we do support that in the home context, but we realized very early on that it was going to be a very small audience that appealed to in terms of the high-end home theater enthusiast who wanted to add even more speakers. So we immediately, are there ways that we can get that sensation of overhead sound without requiring new speakers on the ceiling? So we looked at a variety of different ideas and essentially experimented with a combination of both physical speakers designs as well as signal processing techniques that are generally informed by our understanding of human perception. And one of the first developments we had were these what we call Atmos-enabled speakers. So these upward-firing speakers that can be combined with your existing home theater speakers or built into kind of normal floor-standing speakers that project sound up onto the ceiling, bounce it off, and give you a very good sense of overhead audio. So that was kind of a starting point for making this system more palatable to your average consumer. And we continued to push the boundaries on that. Simultaneous to that development for kind of discrete home theater, we also realized that sound bars, for example, were much more popular in the consumer space than 5.1 or 7.1. It's just much easier for your average consumer to buy this all-in-one device, place it in the front of the room. So we challenged ourselves, saying, is there something we can do with Atmos for the soundbar form factor? So that was another really interesting development, and we took some of the learnings from Atmos-enabled speakers and applied that to kind of rethink what the speaker layouts and soundbars should look like, combined that with new signal processing, and created some really compelling soundbar prototypes that have served as reference designs for our customers. And several years later now, you have numerous manufacturers with Atmos-enabled soundbars on the market, and that's been very successful and allows your average consumer to get a great Atmos experience in a very simple form factor. And we've continued to evolve those technologies. The original focus on Atmos was cinematic content, but as we've mentioned, music is a big push right now. And the way people listen to music in their homes is definitely different than content that's tied to a screen. Obviously, there's headphones, and I'll let Rhonda speak to that in a second, which is kind of its own development. But on the speaker side, for example, smart speakers are kind of the mainstream way that people are listening to music over loudspeakers in their home, like the HomePod or the Amazon Echo. And so, as the next step, we took those learning from soundbars, and we worked closely with Amazon, for example, to produce the first Atmos-enabled smart speaker and rolled that out at the same time with the first Atmos music streaming service. And we're continuing, like I said, it's a continuous evolution of those products. And one of the things I'm really excited about is that these devices that people have in their homes now for listening to music and audio in general have a tremendous amount of intelligence built in. All these smart speakers have microphones with voice commands. They're all Wi-Fi enabled, and there's lots of opportunity for getting these devices to operate in interesting ways together to help create great audio experiences. So I'll stop there, and I think it would be worthwhile for Rhonda to mention specifically about the headphone endpoint, because that's a huge one for consumers, where people on the go are listening to music over headphones.
Yeah, sure. And yes, I suspect in terms of hours of music listening, mobile phone access might be the highest, or headphone listening might be the highest number of hours, I think closely followed by the car, which is another important endpoint for us. And so, yes, working with Atmos, we had more freedom than we do with the channel base, but we also have to consider the channel base, because as well as the objects in Atmos, we do also have the beds. And it's been really interesting over the last year or so. Dolby's had a pretty close collaboration with UMG as we try and work out what's the best way to come up with how to mix your content and have it translate well between loudspeakers and between headphones. And so to get the spatial aspect on headphones, we need to get the information about the head-related transfer function. So that's the term we use for how to describe what happens to the sound when it comes from a certain position and gets to each of your two ears. And there we're making use of the fact that, a signal, an object on the right of you, it'll reach your right ear earlier than it reaches your left ear, and it'll also be higher in level on the right side than on the left side. And there's details that vary across the frequency range, and all those details vary as the object is moved in space. And we're also have to think about how do we achieve the equivalent of being in a room, because not many of us live in a space where there are absolutely no echoes. We're used to always walking on the ground, so there's always at least an echo or reflection off the floor, and there's also other reflections. And so we have to come up with modeling, like a nice studio is what we're aiming at, so that we can achieve the effect of getting more externalization and getting that spaciousness with the Atmos, from the Atmos information. And then there's another aspect that we bring in on the headphone side, is that we can give relatively easily a sense of depth. So when an object is closer to you, there is almost no effect of the room. And when you move it further away, there's much more effect of the room. And so we can give a sense of depth with that as well. And so we have these extra metadata that's specific to headphone to control whether it's near, mid, or far. Or in the extreme case, if they've made a sound very specifically about, say stereo content that they want to put into the Atmos mix, they might even choose to put that into bypass for playing on the headphones. And that gives some flexibility of how you get the most of the Atmos experience on headphones, and so that you translate those ideas well over to loudspeakers. And whether you start on loudspeakers or you start your mix on headphones, that you can transfer those ideas between the two using the Atmos format. And then we have to deliver it to the consumer, of course, and that's some extra techniques come in on getting that efficiently coded and sent to mobile devices.
Yeah, and in terms of devices too, I think that's another important point here, is that I think currently the number now is there's 1 billion devices in market, which is a pretty astounding number when you think about it. So, as RJ alluded to earlier, this has been a long process to develop those relationships and get all those products in market, and the research involved with making that available via a sound bar or something like the Amazon Echo Studio, for instance, at the low price point. Really is amazing in terms of our ability and our reach now with the technology.
Yeah, maybe building on that. I mean, it does come to recognize just how big of, how much energy goes into this, broadly speaking. I mean, there's this core technology component, which is incredibly compelling. And then there's this outreach that we have with our trusted partners that we engage with, and it's usually pretty immediate that we're able to light up content creators with excitement around what we're showing. That tends to come pretty quick because it is a compelling experience, and of course they want the most compelling experience they have to tell their story. It's another thing then to figure out how to make that into a market dynamic that actually gets people to buy in on this from a business perspective, because they need to spend money and get behind this. The part where Philip just mentioned, there's 1 billion devices out there, clearly indicates that threshold has been reached a while ago, and in fact beat. This is the modality in which people are now doing content. I mean, Netflix, all original content will be in Atmos, full stop. We have a lot of that going on, and some of these other content modes now that are coming online are all aiming in that direction as well. And then Philip, I mean, we didn't have this really kind of queued up, but there's that thing that you were doing too around the creation stuff with Dolby On, and that kind of taps into just a broader element of aspects of this too, even though it's a bit of a tangent.
Yeah, it is a bit of a tangent, but I'm always happy to talk about it, RJ. You know that. RJ's referring to a really good story about innovation too at Dolby, which it relates back to a conversation in our cafe some years ago, longer than I care to admit, with one of our researchers from the Barcelona office, with the idea around how we could do easy and simple, high quality music recording with full fun. And so we spun up a small team to work on that, and I'm proud to say today we've had a product in market about 1.5 years now called Dolby On, and it's something that you can go and download for free from either the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store. But the product itself is pretty interesting. It is a product that is simple to use. It allows musicians or anyone to record themselves with very high quality Dolby audio. We're doing a lot of processing where we're doing stereo widening. We have a really clever dynamic EQ. leveling, loudness. We have some really interesting EQ profiles that you can choose from, sort of like Instagram filters for audio, if you will. It's all real time. We can live stream to Facebook, Twitch, and many other sources. And it's just a good example of something that we developed internally, really to understand more about the market. And now we're seeing where that can go to next. And we also leverage that for our relationship with SoundCloud, where we've introduced music mastering on the SoundCloud platform, and that's powered by Dolby. And it was the basis of that technology that we use on Dolby On. So, RJ, thank you for the shameless plug.
Yeah.
Go check it out. It's free.
There was actually a two-pronged reason for that. One is because I think it's really cool. It is really cool. I'm a musician, and it's really cool. The other part of that, though, is, you know, as we start talking about what does it take to actually build these things into products and get them, you know, distributed and all the rest of that, even this Atmos reality. We end up having a lot of stuff within Dolby that is built off of other core ecosystems that we continue to build on and evolve. And sometimes we have to build new trees off of that and build new things to really get to the kind of capabilities that we want. You know, while the Dolby On thing doesn't necessarily tap into this multidimensional audio thing, it does pull on a lot of these things that we pull on in other areas as well in order to make this all be realized in the real world. You know, Justin, we had hoped would be here for this conversation. He really is having some difficulties getting in. So we'll share that thread across the rest of you guys here. But maybe building off of where I was just kind of going with this, when we start thinking about how do you actually take this into something that we can build on and share into a backwards compatible environment that we've got out there in the world, as well as advancing some of the feature sets to be able to move on, which causes us to build new models. There's codecs, there's standardization, there's other elements to all of that. Does one of you want to take a stab at starting to talk through some of that?
I guess I can jump in on the codec side of things. I mean, you're really talking about, you know, from a practical sense, how do you get this content that the content creators are spending hours creating and get it down into someone's home? You know, it's got to be distributed in a practical way. And this is something Dolby's done for decades. You know, we're known for our expertise in audio codecs, meaning how do you take raw audio data, compress it down into a small enough format that we can deliver to a consumer in a practical way. And, you know, what that means has evolved over time too. You know, it used to be not that long ago, shiny discs, you know, Blu-ray, for example, but now, you know, streaming services are the main mechanism of delivery, and, you know, the data rates are much lower, so you have to work harder to get that data rate down to something small enough. And so in the past, we've dealt with audio channels, and we had developed lots of expertise around how to deal with those channels and kind of figure out what information was perceptually irrelevant and throw it away. But this was kind of different. We've got now this audio format that's 128 audio objects with metadata. That's a massive amount of data, and trying to figure out how to scrunch that down into these small pipes. So it actually required the invention of a remarkable amount of new technology, like fundamentally new compression techniques that people hadn't really been thinking about before. It was pretty amazing to watch how rapidly those were developed. But you know, there was new techniques that thought about what does it mean for something to be kind of perceptually irrelevant in terms of three-dimensional space, and how you kind of compress things in those dimensions, as opposed to just thinking about what, you know, frequencies can you throw away. So all sorts of new codec tools were developed to deal with that. And then I would say the other side of it was, you know, Dolby had an enormous install base of our own codecs in the field in terms of televisions and AVRs and other soundbars that were, you know, dealing with 5.1 audio and 7.1. And the thought was, if we can develop a technique that piggybacks on top of that existing install base, that's going to be a much easier sell to get this into the consumer space, as opposed to requiring people to install a brand new type of codec or have content that wasn't compatible with existing techniques. So again, there was a big effort to figure out a way to make the Atmos encoded content be, like I said, backwards compatible with those existing codecs. So we have a solution that uses our Dolby Digital Plus decoder, where there's there's a 5.1 or 7.1 core mix that's contained inside of there. And if you have an old codec, it'll happily decode the 5.1 or 7.1. But then there's this new metadata that's put on top of it that's derived from the Atmos content. And if you have one of the new decoders, it uses that metadata to recreate all the audio objects of the Atmos content, which can then go into a new Atmos render. So I think that was a really key component to getting this successfully deployed in a relatively short period of time on a lot of devices, and make it so that the streaming services, if they decided they wanted to put Atmos content up there, they knew it was going to work with older devices as well. So yeah, that was I think some really important aspects to getting this to the consumers in a practical way.
I was just going to underline that same thing. What I think is so cool is that you can have these Atmos mixes that render down to whatever your device is and whatever the capabilities of that device is, and it works and it sounds great. And that's, that was no small feat, as Alan pointed out.
I'm curious, actually. I don't know the answer to this. I know that we work with lighting up a whole number of different services across the entirety of the globe. So it's there's all sorts of different realities associated with that. And how many tweaks and inputs have we needed to do to create new capabilities to be able to address that specific needs of a particular service wanting to launch on a particular type of a device? Has that been material, or is that just kind of fallen into the master mix of it all?
I was thinking this is where we wanted Justin for that and helping answer that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually don't know the question. I think there's been some level of effort, certainly, but it's a good question. I mean, I've been involved in the music side in terms of rolling out services like Amazon and Tidal and others. And there's definitely nuances to each of those services, in terms of what has to happen. It doesn't impact the format; it impacts the delivery and how that's done on the service. But yeah, it's an interesting question on on some of the streaming services, the Apple TVs of the world. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, a key move forward that's happened in that area since we first brought out Dolby Atmos is the evolution of all the cloud-based engineering and the fact that we can have our encoders running there. So when we first, we're putting out encoders for Dolby Digital and Dolby Digital Plus, and probably even some of the first DD Plus Jock ones, it was more about specific boxes that had to go and physically be in a certain place that were preparing doing all the encoding and sending out the streams. And now as all the cloud-based engineering and computing has moved forward, that has helped us, I think, to when something is tweaked in R&D and engineering to get it out to the services much more quickly.
Yeah, I mean, that would be another spot that Justin's got the expertise in, is our investment into the whole cloud encoding side of the house, which is definitely moving forward. We at Dolby have a couple of different aspects of that. There's one that is just really building APIs that allow people to come send bits through it and get a result out the tail end of that. That's not a heavy customer heavy lift for us. We just put that up there and people can use it as they see fit. There's another element that we are charging forward with, which is more around us actually doing that kind of encoding up on the cloud ourselves. Today, it's all a bunch of pro tools, like professional tools, that get implemented in pro products that actually does all that work for us. And so the services themselves actually have that. They can encode that through those boxes and then send it on down the pipes to these playback devices. As we move forward, a lot of that's going to look to do that kind of encoding in the cloud and do real-time encoding and figure out, all sorts of sophisticated, advanced capabilities of the future, which we are inventing at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's another important part of the story is how far we've come. I mean, as you can all attest, in the early days of Atmos, the level of hardware required to create an Atmos track was significant, and it's interesting just to see in a few short years how quickly that's changed, and that's what I'm probably most excited about is some of the cloud computing capabilities that are coming down the line, and being able to do this with a reasonably small hardware profile is going to be amazing. Even what we're able to do right now and with headphones has been an amazing step forward. It used to be that you could only do these mixes in a properly equipped room, which not a lot of people had.
So how accessible is it right now to anybody that's wanting to get into creating Atmos content? Is it I need a laptop running Pro Tools and a set of headphones? Is it I need a machine with liquid cooling in it and something else? Where are we with that?
See, you can do a whole lot with a MacBook running Pro Tools and the Dolby Atmos production suite and a pair of headphones. And Pro Tools is not the only DAW that you can use. It links with Ableton and Logic Pro and several others. And I mean, Pro Tools is probably the predominant one used in the cinema and post-production space. But in music, there are other DAWs that are more significant or used by a larger number of content creators. And so, yeah, you can get going with a MacBook running your DAW and the Dolby Atmos production suite and headphones. And the assets that are produced from that, the Dolby Atmos Print Master, it's the same whether you're mixing on headphones or on loudspeakers. And we'd still recommend that you check your mix on loudspeakers as well as on headphones. But what we're finding in the music space is that content creators are feeling like they can get a good 90% of their work done on headphones, and the amount of change they make when they go into the studios is very small. And over time they get experience on, okay, these are the techniques that translate best.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's exactly what the engineers have been learning is they do a few mixes on headphones. They realize what they're going to have to do in the loudspeaker mix after listening to it on loudspeakers, and then they adapt for that. So it's, I mean, RJ, to answer your question, no flux capacitor required.
Yeah.
Pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Not always the case. I mean, when you walk into Alan's lab or something Ron is working on, there's usually some flux capacitor in there, in fact, and wires hanging all over the place. And
just for show.
That's okay.
Job security.
It's a lot of fun. If any of you that are watching us here and listening in have any questions, please feel free to feed them into the chat window there. We'd love to hear from you if you got something that you want to ask on any of this. I guess one of the other pieces to this whole thing, and I touched on it a little bit earlier, but is just recognizing this takes a whole company to actually get something like this implemented and out to the world and supported and moving forward. So yes, it definitely requires the start point of this. The nugget comes from the researchers that are sitting on the screen here talking to us today. I mean, they are the ones that invent this stuff. A lot of that is in concert with conversations with our core partners, trying to understand our overall strategic direction. But it really is looking at the root of what our capabilities are and how do we advance the art of sound in this case, and science. And from that, it then starts to get constructed into, we need to actually build this into a product now, not just a prototype. And now we need to start engaging with customers in a different way. And so you lap in product managers and program managers and sales people and sales operations and tech operations, and like the whole machine of the whole organization comes to life in support of these things to both get them out to the world, but also to be ears and eyes out in the world to listen to how it's landing and what's coming back at us. And then feed those challenges back towards these wizards on the screen here to help us come up with new other solutions for that stuff. So I just wanted to call that out.
It takes a village, man. I mean, you think about what's been involved. I mean, and RJ, you can attest to this. If you go back to the first efforts we were making around immersive audio, working in little rooms, trying to figure that out. It's been a long road, and as you point out, just a massive effort to make this happen. Yeah.
I think to that end, maybe dig in a little bit deeper, Rhonda, if you wouldn't mind, on the headphone thing, because I know that one has really taken some real energy to try to just continue to get that last little nugget of goodness out of it.
Yes, and I think the whole collaboration with mixers, both internally and externally, has been the real key to that. As in, you get to the point where we've brought to it our best know-how to date on what do we need to know about our heads and ears, and what do we need to know about the room. But it's then actually working with the content and finding out what techniques work, and are there changes we need to make on our side on the rendering, but are there techniques that the content creators need to develop. And I would say there's still a lot to happen in terms of the Atmos music space that's not just specific to headphone, but just getting the most out of the format. So in the music space, a lot of the content creation pipeline is still very stereo based. And the earlier we can move into the earlier stages of the content creation. So rather than just thinking about Atmos at the mixing stage, think about that also as you record, as you compose. Think about what you might do on synthesizers as well, and be always thinking, okay, how does that work out on the headphones, and how does that work out on the loudspeakers? And there's things that we're looking at internally that we'll be aiming to bring to market further out. And an example there is exactly what happens with our head and our ears in terms of how that affects the sound that reaches our eardrums. That varies from individual to individual. So we can get to good results with a sort of a common way of processing, but we can also get to better results when we bring some personalization aspects into that. So that's another key aspect that we're working on within Dolby, and also in some collaborations as well.
You, the car piece was mentioned briefly, and we think of an automotive as a car as another playback device essentially now. At least that's how Dolby is now starting to think about it, aside from our commute vehicle. What are the unique challenges associated with that we've had to dig into?
Yeah, the automotive space is interesting. In some ways, it's kind of like the perfect playback environment for Atmos and Atmos music in particular. People listen to music in their cars. They are also seated in a particular location, and the speakers are fixed. They're not moving around like they are in the home. So it's kind of a more predictable environment. So you've got a captive audience and a whole bunch of loudspeakers all around you. So in that sense, it's kind of, like I said, perfect for Atmos music playback. On the other hand, you don't have one listener sitting in the middle of all these, equidistant from all the loudspeakers. You got someone up against the door, and if you try to do overhead speakers, it might be right up in their ear. And so kind of dealing with the odd geometry and reflections of the audio inside of the cabin can be challenging. And those are things we're all looking at right now in terms of, making the mix sound balanced like it does in the studio, but in translating that into the car. So, we've made a lot of progress, and we're really excited about the results. It's just, required us to kind of, think about the approach differently. But it's kind of the same type of thing when we were adapting it to soundbars, for example. It's trying to keep in mind what the original intent of the content is, and then try to think smartly about how people are hearing the acoustics in that particular environment, and adapt to try to give the best result. And I'm really excited about what's going to be coming out soon in the automotive space.
Yeah, there's another part of automotive which is not as much related to the technology, but more related to the business equation with the automotive market that's really changed. And that's, when we've been in the automotive space for years, and the issue before was always lead time. Is that, like, if you developed technology, it would be 5 years before it could see a car, right? Because that was just the lead time in the automotive world. And that's dramatically changed in the last 5 years, say, probably something like that. I don't exactly know, but it's dramatically changed to the point where we're able to do, over-the-air updates, for instance, that make significant differences in things like, car head units. And also just the production cycles have decreased dramatically. A lot of the electric car producers now their lead times are much, much shorter, on the orders of so that's a really interesting part of the market where it's growing quickly, because we're able to influence the market much faster now, as well, with the relationships that we're developing there.
Nice. With that whole scope of everything that we just kind of talked about, from creation through playback, the whole distribution mechanism, kind of the future where that's going, are there any other just practical elements or other elements that are worth raising here for the audience on just how this whole thing kind of glues together and how best to make use of this going forward?
Yeah, I'll just quickly jump in again from kind of the future state, which is, we're really excited about putting these tools in the hands of folks and seeing what they do with it, right? So, on the Dolby I/O side, there's really some fascinating use cases that are developing. One example is we're dealing with a lot of customers who are creating, especially in the time of COVID, that are creating sort of enhanced virtual interactive experiences. So, customers who are building platforms that are virtual worlds, for instance, to have a conference in. And so imagine a situation where you're attending a conference virtually. We're all sitting at home right now. But if we were attending a conference, I guess as we are, the ability for us to see a 3D or a three-dimensional space that we're in, imagine there would be a stage in front of us and we're sitting in chairs, and I could place myself next to RJ and have an audio experience with RJ, which would be he and I could speak to one another. But if Rhonda and Alan were on the other side of this virtual cinema, they couldn't be talking because of the spatial aspects of it. So when we talk about sort of multidimensional audio and spatial audio, those are the kind of places that we're looking to go now, where our customers can build these virtual platforms using our spatial audio capabilities and have that kind of separation. And if Alan then walked up and sat next to RJ and I, as he approached, our conversation would get louder with the ambience in the background of whatever was happening in terms of the presentation at the time. So it's those kinds of things that are really exciting. There's also just all kinds of really interesting things happening in the podcast world with spatial audio, where producers are using spatial audio to do some really clever mixes to really improve intelligibility. And so we're seeing a lot of interest in that world. And then I guess lastly, I would just add that, the other obvious thing that's happening in the virtual world is musical performances are really expanding dramatically. We have so many folks who have come to us who have been promoters and wanting to have virtual experiences during the time of COVID. But as they look forward, the world has changed fundamentally. And so how can they enable hybrid experiences that have both immersive audio virtually and even immersive audio in a live situation? So I think one of the things that COVID has done is really accelerated some of the needs for these technologies. And so we're trying to answer those as quickly as we can. And it's really interesting to see just through customer conversations and just keeping our ear to the ground where it's going and what people are wanting to see.
Yeah, thanks for pushing it out. And
then something I'd add, just for if there's content creators, whether they're from the students or the faculty, especially if they've come from a music space where up to now things have been predominantly working in stereo, is to really start exploring the extra space you literally have to work with in Atmos. And in stereo, you're having to do so much with your EQ and levels to try and work out, how do I pack all that information into something that's really just left to right in front of me? And then in Atmos, you think, well, actually, I have all these choices, so I don't have to sort of do so much EQ and level adjustment. It's easier for our brains to interpret the information that's coming from all around. And that opens up all sorts of creative possibilities. So, I'm happy with the links that Philip's provided to our, there's like 90-day free trials of that we can see students and other content creators really starting to experiment with the new options that you get by working in the Atmos format.
Yeah, actually, if I could build on that for a second, it struck me even when we were kicking this off that, we were coming up with our hypotheses around use cases based on what we knew at the time. And some of that was the same thing that you would get from just spatial audio in a cinematic mix or whatever. But what we found is, and what I anticipated is, as soon as you get this out into the hands of creatives, they're going to be creative with it and do things with it that we were not anticipating. And hooray. And I'm sure we've seen some of that, but even, beyond the, wow, you can put ceiling speakers and have cymbals up there or whatever, it's not that. It's actually that you can just get a little bit of separation between the kick drum and the, this space, and the snare drum, if you wanted to just really break apart a drum kit, just as an example. And when you can get that sort of separation in the mix, then you don't have all these frequencies fighting with each other for the same exact space in your head. And so it kind of opens that up quite a bit. And I've heard enough of that content to be completely compelled, and to the advantages of what that brings. There is an element to a degree that struck me early on that around, there's a path to, all of us are used to stereo music. So we're trained to hear it that way. And the first couple of times I listened to Atmos music mixes in particular, it just kind of makes you think a little bit differently. And then once you get into it, it's just like, you just let yourself go there. It's just wide open and amazing. But there is a bit of it feels different. It sounds different than stereo. So it takes a minute to kind of get yourself centered around that. And once you do, it's just obviously bigger and better.
Yeah, I'll just jump on there. One of the things that we hear time and time again is, it's around this idea of intelligibility as it relates to things like dialogue. Well, that's interesting. But when it's music, it's much more, it's very visceral, right? It's this very sort of, your hair stands on end when you hear it, because it is different. And it's providing space in the music, and having spent a lot of time around stereo mixes, that's one thing you realize, is that there's just space for the music, and there's space for the individual instrumentation. And the story, one of the stories I love about Atmos was, this was really early on working with a band and an artist. And this is like an artist you've all heard, and this is a song you've all heard. And we were playing back a mix for him in our cinema, in our offices in San Francisco, which is just this amazing room. And we're playing back this Atmos mix, and his comment was, "I've never heard that guitar piece in this song before, and I played it." Right? And which was like, that was like, all right, that was great. And he was just, he was blown away, like, because like he's like, did you change it? Did you increase the volume of it? No, it was just like, it was pulled apart, and the mix just had more room.
Well, we're coming close to the top of the hour. I'll offer again, if any of you have any questions, please drop them in the chat, and if it pops up in the next minute or so, we'll try to get there. While that's going on, any other sort of final thoughts from the rest of the panel here?
Yeah, check out those links, and please take advantage of them if you can. There's some great stuff. The curriculum there, if you want to really go deep, is very very engaging, and a lot of great information there. So please check it out.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.